4. The beans were like bullets, the corn tough. Outside, the prevailing wind snuffled and whined around the ground level eaves. The gunslinger ate quickly, ravenously, drinking 4 cups of water with the meal. Halfway through, there was a machine gun rapping at the door. Brown got up and let Zoltan in. The bird flew across the room and hunched moodily in the corner. "Musical fruit," he muttered. "You ever think about eating him?" the gunslinger asked. The dweller laughed. "Animals that talk be tough," he said. "Birds, billy bumblers, human beings, they be tough eating." After dinner, the gunslinger offered his tobacco. The dweller, Brown, accepted eagerly. Now, the gunslinger thought, now the questions will come. But Brown asked no questions. He smoked tobacco that had been grown in Garland years before and looked at the dying embers of the fire. Cooler in the hovel. "Lead us not lead us not into temptation," Zoltan said suddenly, apocalyptically. The gunslinger started as if he had been shot at. He was suddenly sure all of this was an illusion, that the man in black had spun a spell and was trying to tell him something in a maddeningly obtuse, symbolic way. "Do you know Tull?" he asked suddenly. Brown nodded. "Came through it to get here. Went back once to sell corn and drink a glass of whiskey. It rained that year. Lasted maybe 15 minutes. The ground just seemed to open and suck it up. An hour later, it was just as white and dry as ever. But the corn, God, the corn, you could see it grow. That wasn't so bad. But you could hear it, as if the rain had given it a mouth. It wasn't a happy sound. It seemed to be sighing and groaning its way out of the earth." He paused. "I had extra, so I took it and sold it. Papa Doc said he'd do it, but he would have cheated me, so I went." "You don't like town?" "No. I almost got killed there," the gunslinger said. "Do you say so?" "Set my watch and warrant on it, and I killed a man that was touched by God," the gunslinger said. "Only it wasn't God. It was the man with the rabbit up his sleeve, the man in black. He laid you a trap. You say true, I say thank you." They looked at each other across the shadows, the moment taking on overtones of finality. Now, the questions will come. But Brown still had no questions to ask. His cigarette was down to a smoldering roach, but when the gunslinger tapped his poke, Brown shook his head. Zoltan shifted restlessly, seemed about to speak, subsided. "Will I tell you about it?" the gunslinger asked. "Ordinarily, I'm not much of a talker, but sometimes talking helps. I'll listen." The gunslinger searched for words to begin and found none. "I have to pass water," he said. Brown nodded. "Pass it on the corn, please." "Sure." He went up the stairs and out into the dark. The stars glittered overhead. The wind pulsed. His urine arced out over the powdery cornfield in a wavering stream. The man in black had drawn him here. It wasn't beyond possibility that Brown was the man in black. He might be. The gunslinger shut these useless and upsetting thoughts away. The only contingency he had not learned how to bear was the possibility of his own madness. He went back inside. "Have you decided if I'm an enchantment yet?" Brown asked, amused. The gunslinger paused on the tiny landing, startled. Then he came down slowly and sat. The thought crossed my mind. "Are you?" "If I am, I don't know it." This wasn't a terribly helpful answer, but the gunslinger decided to let it pass. "I started to tell you about Tull." "Is it growing?" "It's dead," the gunslinger said. "I killed it." He thought of adding, "And now I'm going to kill you, if for no other reason than I don't want to have to sleep with one eye open." But had he come to such behavior? If so, why bother to go on at all? Why, if he had become what he pursued? Brown said, I don't want nothing from you, Gunslinger, except to still be here when you move on. I won't beg for my life, but that don't mean I don't want it yet a while longer. The gunslinger closed his eyes. His mind whirled. Tell me what you are, he said thickly. Just a man, one who means you no harm, and I'm still willing to listen if you're willing to talk. To this the gunslinger made no reply. I guess you won't feel right about it unless I invite you, Brown said, and so I do. Will you tell me about Tull? The gunslinger was surprised to find that this time the words were there. He began to speak in flat bursts that slowly spread into an even, slightly toneless narrative. He found himself oddly excited. He talked deep into the night. Brown did not interrupt at all. Neither did the bird. 5. He'd bought the mule in Pricetown, and when he reached Tull, it was still fresh. The sun had set an hour earlier, but the gunslinger had continued traveling, guided by the town glow in the sky, then by the uncannily clear notes of a honky-tonk piano playing Hey Jude. The road widened as it took on tributaries. Here and there were overhead sparklights, all of them long dead. The forests were long gone now, replaced by the monotonous flat prairie country. Endless, desolate fields gone to timothy and low shrubs. Eerie, deserted estates guarded by brooding, shadowed mansions, where demons undeniably walked, leering, empty shadows where the people had either moved on or had been moved along. An occasional dweller's hovel given away by a single flickering point of light in the dark, or by sullen, inbred clan farms toiling silently in the fields by day. Corn was the main crop, but there were beans and also some pokeberries. An occasional scrawny cow stared at him lumpishly from between peeled alder poles. Coaches had passed him 4 times, twice coming and twice going, nearly empty as they came up on him from behind and bypassed him and his mule, fuller as they headed back towards the forests of the north. Now and then a farmer passed with his feet up on the splashboard of his bucka, careful not to look at the man with the guns. It was ugly country. It had showered twice since he had left Pricetown, grudgingly both times. Even the timothy looked yellow and dispirited. Pass on by, country. He had seen no sign of the man in black. Perhaps he had taken a coach. The road made a bend, and beyond it the gunslinger clucked the mule to a stop and looked down at Tull. It was at the floor of a circular, bowl-shaped hollow, a shoddy jewel in a cheap setting. There were a number of lights, most of them clustered around the area of the music. There looked to be 4 streets, 3 running at right angles to the coach road, which was the main avenue of the town. Perhaps there would be a cafe. He doubted it, but perhaps. He clucked at the mule. More houses sporadically lined the road now, most of them still deserted. He passed a tiny graveyard with moldy, leaning wooden slabs overgrown and choked by the rank devil grass. Perhaps 500 feet further on he passed a chewed sign which said, Tull. The paint was flaked almost to the point of illegibility. There was another further on, but the gunslinger was not able to read that one at all. A fool's chorus of half-stoned voices was rising in the final protracted lyric of Hey Jude. Na 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 na, Hey Jude. As he entered the town proper, it was a dead sound, like the wind in the hollow of a rotted tree. Only the prosaic thump and pound of the honky-tonk piano saved him from seriously wondering if the man in black might not have raised ghosts to inhabit a deserted town. He smiled a little at the thought. There were people on the streets, but not many. 3 ladies wearing black slacks and identical high-collared blouses passed by on the opposite boardwalk, not looking at him with pointed curiosity. Their faces seemed to swim above their all but invisible bodies like pallid balls with eyes. A solemn old man with a straw hat perched firmly on top of his head watched him from the steps of a boarded-up mercantile store. A scrawny tailor with a late customer paused to watch him go by. He held up the lamp in his window for a better look. The gunslinger nodded. Neither the tailor nor his customer nodded back. He could feel their eyes resting heavily upon the low-slung holsters that lay against his hips. A young boy, perhaps 13, and a girl who might have been his sissa or his jilly child crossed the street a block up, pausing imperceptibly. Their footfalls raised little hanging clouds of dust. Here in town, most of the street-side lamps worked, but they weren't electric. Their icingless glass sides were cloudy with congealed oil. Some had been crashed out. There was a livery with a just hanging on look to it, probably depending on the coach line for its survival. 3 boys were crouched silently around a marble ring drawn in the dust to one side of the barn's gaping maw, smoking corn shuck cigarettes. They made long shadows in the yard. One had a scorpion's tail poked in the band of his hat. Another had a bloated left eye bulging sightlessly from its socket. The gunslinger led his mule past them and looked into the dim depths of the barn. One lamp glowed sunkenly. A shadow jumped and flickered as a gangling old man in bib overalls forked loose timothy hay into the hayloft with big, grunting swipes of his fork. "Hey!" the gunslinger called. The fork faltered, and the hostler looked around with yellow-tinged eyes. "Hey yourself! I got a mule here." "Good for you!" The gunslinger flicked a heavy, unevenly milled gold piece into the semi-dark. It rang on the old, chaff-drifted boards and glittered. The hostler came forward, bent, picked it up, squinted at the gunslinger. His eyes dropped to the gun belts, and he nodded sourly. "How long you want to put 'em up?" "A night or 2, maybe longer." "I ain't got no change for gold." "Didn't ask for any." "Shoot up money," the hostler muttered. "What did you say?" "Nothing." The hostler caught the mule's bridle and led him inside. "Rub him down," the gunslinger called. "I expect to smell it on him when I come back. Hear me well." The old man did not turn. The gunslinger walked out to the boys crouched around the marble ring. They had watched the entire exchange with contemptuous interest. "Long days and pleasant nights," the gunslinger offered conversationally. No answer. "You fellas live in town?" No answer. Unless the scorpion's tail gave one. It seemed to nod. One of the boys removed a crazily tilted twist of corn shuck from his mouth, grasped a green cat's eye marble, and squirted it into the dirt circle. It struck a croaker and knocked it outside. He picked up the cat's eye and prepared to shoot again. "There a cafe in this town?" the gunslinger asked. One of them looked up, the youngest. There was a huge cold sore at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were both the same size and full of an innocence that wouldn't last long in this shithole. He looked at the gunslinger with hooded, brimming wonder that was touching and frightening. "Might get a burger at Sheb's." "That the honky-tonk?" The boy nodded. "Yar." The eyes of his mates had turned ugly and hostile. He would probably pay for having spoken up in kindness. The gunslinger touched the brim of his hat. "I'm grateful. It's good to know someone in this town is bright enough to talk." He walked past, mounted the boardwalk, and started down towards Sheb's, hearing the clear, contemptuous voice of one of the others, hardly more than a childish treble. "Weed eater! How long you been screwing your sister, Charlie? Weed eater!" Then the sound of a blow and a cry. There were 3 flaring kerosene lamps in front of Sheb's, one to each side and one nailed above the drunk-hung batwing doors. The chorus of "Hey Jude" had petered out, and the piano was plinking some other old ballad. Voices murmured like broken threads. The gunslinger paused outside for a moment, looking in. Sawdust floor, spittoons by the tipsy-legged tables, a plank bar on sawhorses, a gummy mirror behind it reflecting the piano player, who wore an inevitable piano stool slouch. The front of the piano had been removed, so you could watch the wooden keys wonk up and down as the contraption was played. The bartender was a straw-haired woman wearing a dirty blue dress. One strap was held with a safety pin. There were perhaps 6 townies in the back of the room, juicing and playing Watch Me apathetically. Another half dozen were grouped loosely about the piano, 4 or 5 at the bar, and an old man with wild gray hair collapsed at a table by the doors. The gunslinger went in. Had swiveled to look at him and his guns. There was a moment of near silence, except for the oblivious piano player, who continued to tinkle. Then the woman mopped at the bar, and things shifted back. "Watch me," one of the players in the corner said, and matched 3 hearts with 4 spades, emptying his hand. The one with the heart swore, pushed over his stake, and the next hand was dealt. The gunslinger approached the woman at the bar. "You got meat?" he asked. "Sure." She looked him in the eye, and she might have been pretty when she started out, but the world had moved on since then. Now her face was lumpy, and there a livid scar went corkscrewing across her forehead. She had powdered it heavily, and the powder called attention to what it had meant to camouflage. "Clean beef. Threaded stock. It's dear, though." "Threaded stock, my ass," the gunslinger thought. "What you got in your cooler came from something with 3 eyes, 6 legs, or both. That's my guess, Lady Sigh. I want 3 burgers and a beer. Would it please you?" Again, the subtle shift in tone. 3 hamburgers. Mouths watered and tongues licked at saliva with slow lust. 3 hamburgers. Had anyone here ever seen anyone eat 3 hamburgers at a go? "That would go you $5. Do you keen bucks? Dollars?" She nodded. So she was probably saying bucks. That was his guess, anyway. "That with the beer?" he asked, smiling a little. "Or is the beer extra?" She didn't return the smile. "I'll throw in the suds. Once I see the color of your money, that is." The gunslinger put a gold piece on the bar, and every eye followed it. There was a smoldering charcoal cooker behind the bar and to the left of the mirror. The woman disappeared into a small room behind it and returned with meat on a paper. She scrimped out 3 patties and put them on the grill. The smell that arose was maddening. The gunslinger stood with stolid indifference, only peripherally aware of the faltering piano, the slowing of the card game, the sidelong glances of the barflies. The man was halfway up behind him when the gunslinger saw him in the mirror. The man was almost completely bald, and his hand was wrapped around the haft of a gigantic hunting knife that was looped onto his belt like a holster. "Go sit down," the gunslinger said. "Do yourself a favor, cully." The man stopped. His upper lip lifted unconsciously like a dog's, and there was a moment of silence. Then he went back to his table, and the atmosphere shifted back again. Beer came in a cracked glass schooner. "I ain't got change for gold." "I ain't got change for gold," the woman said truculently. "Don't expect any." She nodded angrily, as if the show of wealth, even at her benefit, incensed her. But she took his gold, and a moment later the hamburgers came on a cloudy plate, still red around the edges. "Do you have salt?" She gave it to him in a little crock she took from underneath the bar, white lumps he'd have to crumble with his fingers. "Bread?" "No bread." He knew she was lying, but he also knew why and didn't push it. The bald man was staring at him with cyanosed eyes, his hands clenching and unclenching on the splintered and gouged surface of his table. His nostrils flared with pulsating regularity, scooping up the smell of the meat. That at least, was free. The gunslinger began to eat steadily, not seeming to taste, merely chopping the meat apart and forking it into his mouth, trying to not think of what the cow this had come from must have looked like. Threaded stock, she had said. Yes, quite likely. And pigs would dance the Kamala in the light of the peddler's moon. He was almost through, ready to call for another beer and roll a smoke, when the hand fell on his shoulder. He suddenly became aware that the room had once more gone silent, and he tasted tension in the air. He turned around and stared into the face of the man who had been asleep by the door when he entered. It was a terrible face. The odor of the devil grass was a rank miasma. The eyes were damned, the staring, glaring eyes of one who sees but does not see. Eyes ever turned inward to the sterile hell of dreams beyond control. Dreams unleashed, risen out of stinking swamps of the unconscious. The woman behind the bar made a small moaning sound. The cracked lips writhed, lifted, revealing the green, mossy teeth, and the gunslinger thought, he's not even smoking it anymore. He's chewing it. He's really chewing it. And on the heels of that, he's a dead man. He should have been dead a year ago. And on the heels of that, the man in black did this. They stared at each other, the gunslinger and the man who had gone around the rim of madness. He spoke, and the gunslinger, dumbfounded, heard himself addressed in the high speech of Gilead. The gold for a favor, Gunslinger sigh. Just one. For a pretty. The high speech. For a moment, his mind refused to track it. It had been years, God, centuries, millenniums. There was no more high speech. He was the last gunslinger. The others were all... Numbed, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold piece. The split, scabbed, gangrenous hand reached for it, fondled it, held it up to reflect the greasy glare of the kerosene lamps. It threw off its proud civilized glow, golden, reddish, bloody. An inarticulate sound of pleasure. The old man did a weaving turn and began moving back to his table, holding the coin at eye level, turning it, flashing it. The room was emptying rapidly, the batwings shuttling madly back and forth. The piano player closed the lid of his instrument with a bang and exited after the others in a long, comic opera strides. "Sheb!" the woman screamed after him, her voice an odd mixture of fear and shrewishness. "Shreb, you come back here, goddammit!" Was that a name the gunslinger had heard before? He thought yes, but there was no time to reflect upon it now, or to cast his mind back. The old man, meanwhile, had gone back to his table. He spun the gold pieces on the gouged wood, and the dead-alive eyes followed it with empty fascination. He spun it a second time, a third, and his eyelids drooped. The fourth time, and his head settled to the wood before the coin stopped. "There," she said softly, furiously. "You've driven out my trade. Are you satisfied?" "They'll be back," the gunslinger said. "Not tonight, they won't." "Who is he?" He gestured to the weed eater. "Go fuck yourself." Sigh. "I have to know," the gunslinger said patiently. He talked to you funny," she said. "Nort never talked like that in his life." "I'm looking for a man. You would know him." She stared at him, the anger dying. It was replaced with speculation, then with a high, wet gleam he had seen before. The rickety building ticked thoughtfully to itself. A dog barked brayingly far away. The gunslinger waited. She saw his knowledge, and the gleam was replaced by hopelessness, by a dumb need that had no mouth. "I guess maybe you know my price," she said. "I got an itch I used to be able to take care of, but now I can't." He looked at her steadily. The scar would not show in the dark. Her body was lean enough so the desert and grit and grind hadn't been able to sag everything. And she'd once been pretty, maybe even beautiful. Not that it mattered. It would not have mattered if the grave beetles had nested in the arid blackness of her womb. It had all been written. Somewhere, some hand had put it all down in Ka's book. Her hands came up to her face, and there was still some juice left in her, enough to weep. "Don't look! You don't have to look at me so mean!" "I'm sorry," the gunslinger said. "I didn't mean to be mean." "None of you mean it," she cried at him. Close the place up and put out the lights. She wept, hands at her face. He was glad she had her hands at her face. Not because of the scar, but because it gave her back her maidenhood, if not her maidenhead. The pin that held the strap of her dress glittered in the greasy light. "Will he steal anything? I'll put him out if he will." "No," she whispered. "Nort don't steal." Then put out the lights. She would not remove her hands until she was behind him, and she doused the lamps one by one, turning down the wicks and breathing the flames into extinction. Then she took his hand in the dark, and it was warm. She led him upstairs. There was no light to hide their act.